I had heard the whispers, those hushed voices in the corner of the village tavern, the tremors in the eyes of those who dared speak of him. Count Orlok. They told stories of his castle perched on a distant cliff, his gaunt visage, his terrible thirst. But I, young and naive, dismissed it all as superstition. I was an ambitious man, eager to prove myself in the world, and when I received the letter from an estate agent in Wisborg, I saw it as an opportunity, nothing more. The letter was terse, written in a script that seemed ancient. Its ink faded, as if it had been penned by a hand long deceased. I was to travel to the Count's estate, arrange the sale of the property, and return quickly. Nothing unusual. A simple task for a man eager to make his mark in the world of business. The journey was long and dreary, but I pressed on, the road winding through darkened forests that seemed to swallow the light. My carriage creaked under the weight of its cargo, my hopes, my dreams, my ignorance. As the evening grew colder, a dread began to settle in my bones, but I told myself it was nothing. The village of Wisborg was near, and with it, the promise of something grand. When I arrived, I was struck by the sight of the castle. It loomed above the town like a jagged tooth, its silhouette outlined against the twilight sky. The air grew heavier the closer I got, and I could taste the sharpness of decay on my tongue. Still, I pushed forward, my steps carrying me to the front door. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and unnaturally still. Count Orlok himself. His face was like a mask of death, pale and hollow, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. There was something otherworldly about him, a sense that time had forgotten him, or that perhaps he had forgotten time. "Welcome," he intoned, his voice cold as the grave. "I trust you find my humble abode to your likings?" I forced a smile, though my skin prickled with unease. "Yes, Count. I'm sure everything is in order." His smile, a thin line of sharp teeth, revealed more of his true nature. I couldn't place it then. Perhaps the silence, the unsettling air, but something about him chilled me to the bone. I followed him through the castle's great, echoing halls, the flickering candlelight casting strange shadows on the stone walls. Night descended swiftly, and I was shown to my room. The walls of the castle seemed to close in around me, and despite the grandiosity of the place, there was an overwhelming sense of emptiness. Alone in my chamber, I tried to sleep, but the quiet was too thick, too oppressive. It began with a soft whisper, barely audible, a rustling of fabric. Then, a voice, just a murmur, barely a breath, came from the walls. I couldn't understand it, but the sound felt like it was speaking directly into my mind. I tried to ignore it, to will it away, but it only grew louder. My heart thudded in my chest as I sat up in bed, my eyes scanning the shadows. The moonlight filtered through the cracks in the curtains, casting long, trembling fingers across the floor. I had to know what it was. I had to understand. I left the room, my feet light but unsure as I walked down the long corridors. The castle seemed to stretch endlessly, its labyrinthine design making every turn feel like a journey into madness. It was then that I stumbled upon the crypt. The door was old, rusted with age, but it creaked open with ease, as if it had been expecting me. Inside, a tomb of stone, and silence awaited, the air thick with the scent of decay. And there he was, Count Orlok. He lay in a coffin, his body unnaturally still, his face contorted in a grotesque grimace. His skin was a sickly shade of gray, stretched tight over the bones of his skull. His mouth was open, but no breath escaped his lips. I should have turned away. I should have run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. A shift in the air caught my attention, and my eyes snapped back to Orlok. He moved, slowly, painfully, his limbs stretched with an unnatural creak, and his eyes, those deep, soulless pits, opened to reveal a hunger that chilled me to my core. "Flee," he whispered, his voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "Flee, while you still can." I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. My legs refused to obey. I watched, paralyzed, as Orlok climbed from his coffin. He was no longer the fragile figure I had seen earlier. Now, he seemed to stretch upward, towering over me with a predatory grace. His fingers, long and bony, reached toward me. I felt the cold touch of his hand against my skin, and in that moment, I understood. I understood the stories, the legends. He was no mere man. He was a creature of the night, an ancient thing that fed on the blood of the living. A sharp pain lanced through my neck as he sank his fangs into my flesh, and I gasped, my vision blurring. I could feel the life draining from me, my pulse growing weak. His eyes, those terrible eyes, locked onto mine with a hunger that could never be sated. As I slipped into darkness, I heard him, Orlok, whisper one final word. Forever. When I awoke, I was not in the crypt. I was in a bed, cold and damp with sweat. The familiar sights of Wisborg were gone, replaced by an alien landscape, dark and twisted. The town was silent, its streets empty. The people, once full of life, had vanished, their homes abandoned. I tried to move, but something held me in place, a force stronger than anything I had ever known. It was then that I realized the truth. Count Orlok's curse had followed me. It had followed me back to Wisborg, and now I was part of it. His eyes, his hunger, it was all inside me now. I could feel it gnawing at my insides, an insatiable thirst. I could feel my fingers elongating, my skin paling, my body changing. In that moment, I understood that I was not merely a victim of the vampire. I had become one. I had joined the ranks of the undead. As I wandered the empty streets of Wisborg, I could hear the whispers of the others, those who had fallen under Orlok's curse. Their eyes, hollow and empty, stared at me from the shadows. We were all bound together now, creatures of the night, forever bound to the Count. And the nightmare? It never ends.
I had heard rumors of it long before I was ever exposed. The substance, they called it. A whisper, a secret hidden deep within the underbelly of our small town. No one spoke of it openly, but it was always there, floating just beyond the edges of our normal, everyday lives. People who had tried it didn't speak the same way afterward. They didn't act the same either. Some vanished. Others returned, but they were never quite the same. I was never one to believe in things like that. My life, my job at the local library, was simple and uneventful. I had my routines. I had my friends, normal, grounded people who didn't dabble in anything mysterious. At least, that's what I thought. But then, I met Nathan. Nathan was a writer, a person who had come to town to work on his novel. He stayed in the small apartment above the cafe, the one with the peeling paint and cracked windows. He was the kind of person who had that faraway look in his eyes, as though the world was something he observed from a distance, like it wasn't quite real to him. He was captivating, in a way. The way he spoke about the world and his work, his words were heavy with meaning, though always slightly detached, like they didn't entirely come from him. One evening, over drinks at the cafe, he leaned across the table toward me, his voice lowering as if sharing a secret. "You've heard of the substance, haven't you?" he asked, his voice gravelly, tinged with something I couldn't place. "Rumors. Stories. But I've never seen it," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. Nathan smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "You're not the first person to say that." He paused, then added, "But maybe you should. It's different. It'll change the way you see everything." I laughed nervously, unsure if he was serious. "You're joking, right? It sounds like some kind of urban legend." He didn't laugh. "It's not a legend, trust me. If you want to know the truth about the world, you have to experience it for yourself." I shook my head, still unconvinced, though something about the way he spoke made my heart beat a little faster. "And how exactly does one experience it?" I asked, feeling a sense of dread begin to stir. Nathan's eyes gleamed, almost predatory. "Come with me tomorrow. I'll show you." The next day, I found myself following Nathan to a place I never would have imagined, a hidden warehouse at the edge of town, buried beneath overgrown ivy and forgotten structures. The air around it smelled musty, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something more metallic. He led me inside, through dark hallways that reeked of mildew, until we came to a small room. On the table in front of us, a vial sat, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. The substance. Nathan stood beside it, his eyes fixed on it as if it were some kind of artifact of immense power. "This," he said, his voice low, "is what changes everything." I couldn't stop myself from asking, "What does it do?" "It opens doors," he said simply. "It lets you see what's hidden in the world. The things that can't be seen by normal eyes." I felt a shiver run through me. "What do you mean?" Nathan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up the vial and, with a practiced motion, uncorked it. A thick, sickly vapor wafted into the air, and my stomach churned with unease. I instinctively took a step back, but Nathan caught my arm, his grip tight. "You wanted to see the truth, didn't you?" Against every instinct I had, I nodded. "Yes." With a small smile, Nathan placed a drop of the vapor onto his tongue. He closed his eyes as if savoring it, and when he opened them again, something had changed in his gaze. There was no warmth left in his eyes, no humanity. Just an emptiness, a void that seemed to stretch endlessly. "Now you see," he whispered. I recoiled, but my body wouldn't move fast enough. The air around me seemed to warp, twisting like smoke, bending the world itself. The walls of the room blurred, stretching and contracting, until I couldn't tell where the room ended and the dark outside began. The floor beneath me felt soft, as though it were shifting like sand. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. My vision swam, and I saw shapes, horrible, distorted shapes, like things that had never existed in this world. Faces that were not faces. Figures that were not human. They were everywhere, creeping just beyond the edges of my sight. In the corners of the room, in the folds of the walls, in the shadows that stretched impossibly long. And Nathan, he stood there, watching it all with a look of serene detachment, as if the chaos unfolding around us was merely a distant spectacle. I could feel the substance working its way into my bloodstream, my veins pulsing with an unnatural heat. It was as though the world around me had peeled back, revealing something monstrous lying just beneath the surface. The truth that Nathan had promised, this was not a truth I could bear. This was not the world I knew. It was something darker, something older. I reached for the door, my body moving without my mind's permission. But when I touched the handle, it felt as if the air itself had turned solid. My skin burned. My bones screamed. "You can't leave," Nathan said softly, his voice distant, as though he were speaking to someone else. "Once you've seen it, there's no turning back." The darkness grew thicker, pressing in around me like a physical weight. The creatures in the corners of the room were drawing closer, their eyes glinting with malice, their mouths stretching open impossibly wide. The walls seemed to pulsate with an alien heartbeat. And then, the world snapped back into focus. I was back in the room, the warehouse, the vial sitting innocuously on the table. I stumbled back, my heart racing in my chest. My mouth was dry, and my legs shook with the aftermath of what I had just experienced. I looked around, but the room was normal. Ordinary. Yet I could still feel them, the things I had seen, lurking just beyond my perception. Their presence was like a weight, a constant pressure, pressing on the back of my mind. Nathan stood silently by the table, watching me, a faint smile curling his lips. "You see now. Nothing is what it seems." I could hardly breathe. What was that? What are they? What is this? "They are the truth," he said. "The substance lets you see beyond the veil. Now you know, what's real, what's hidden, what's always been waiting." I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But I couldn't move. My mind was still reeling, trying to comprehend what I had just witnessed. "You're part of it now," Nathan continued, his voice low, calm. You've tasted the truth. You can never unsee it. The veil is gone for you. Welcome to the real world. And with those words, I understood. I was no longer the same. The world, my world, had shattered. I had seen the truth, and now it was part of me. Forever. There was no escaping the substance. And there was no going back to who I had been. I looked up at Nathan, who was still smiling, that cold, detached smile. He had already moved on. For him, this was just another step, another layer peeled away. For me, though, it was the beginning of an endless descent into madness. Heretic. I was just a scholar, a student of ancient texts, with an insatiable hunger for truth. I didn't expect to be drawn into something so unholy. It was supposed to be a simple academic endeavor, uncovering the roots of a long-forgotten religious sect, one that supposedly practiced strange rituals in the hills near our town centuries ago. Nothing more than historical curiosity, I thought. But I should have known better. When I first heard about the manuscript, I was intrigued. It had been discovered in the ruins of an old abbey, hidden deep in the forests outside the city. The pages were ancient, the ink faded to almost nothing, but the words were chilling, speaking of a faith that was not rooted in salvation, but in suffering, in worship of something much darker. The heretic, a term so powerful that it seemed to burn off the page. I had to know more. I visited the ruins with only a flashlight and my notepad, trying to decipher the contents of the manuscript. The wind howled through the broken stone walls, a constant reminder of the centuries that had passed. But inside, I felt a coldness that was not just from the weather. It was something else, something far older. It was there that I met her, Isabella. She was sitting in the shadows of the abbey, her face pale, her eyes hollow but piercing. She spoke with a voice that carried the weight of 1,000 years, yet her words were like a whisper in my ear. "Do you seek the truth?" she asked, her gaze never leaving my face. I nodded. "I'm studying the old texts. The heretic sect. What happened to them?" She smiled, just a subtle curl of her lips. "They were not lost. They are still here. They are still watching." I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. "What do you mean? Where are they now?" Her fingers reached into the folds of her cloak, pulling out an old pendant. It was a symbol I recognized from the manuscript, an inverted cross wrapped in thorns. The moment she handed it to me, a surge of cold flooded through me, as though I had plunged into an icy lake. My body stiffened, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Hold it," she commanded. And I did. Against all reason, I held it, and that's when the vision started. At first, it was just flashes, a glimpse of an altar, drenched in blood, the faces of people I didn't recognize, twisted in agony, dark figures watching from the shadows, their eyes glimmering with something otherworldly. Then, it all merged together in a single, overwhelming image. I saw a figure, tall, cloaked in black, his face obscured by a dark hood. He stood in front of a crowd, raising his arms as they chanted something in a language I couldn't understand. It was him, the heretic, the leader of the sect. But there was something about him, something that terrified me. He wasn't human. I stumbled back, dropping the pendant. The vision faded, and I was left gasping for air, sweat dripping down my face. "What did you see?" Isabella asked, her voice soft, almost too soft. I could barely respond, my thoughts in disarray. "Who is he? What is that?" Her smile faded, and for a moment, I saw something, an ancient sadness in her eyes, a sorrow that seemed to belong to someone who had lived far too long. "He is the true God," she said, each word dragging out like a weight. "He is the one who walks in the shadows, the one we must serve to be free." I recoiled. "No, that's madness. You're talking about a demon." Isabella's gaze sharpened. "You still don't understand, do you? The church has lied to you. They've hidden the truth for centuries. The heretic is not a demon, but a god who demands worship not of obedience, but of suffering. I shook my head, my heart racing. This is blasphemy. You're a cultist. She laughed softly, almost sadly. I was once like you. A seeker of truth. But now, I have seen the light, the true light. And now, it is too late. I felt my stomach twist as if the ground beneath me were about to swallow me whole. Too late? Too late for what? She took a step closer, her eyes dark and full of something I could not comprehend. Too late for you to leave. You have already begun the ritual, and once it has begun, it cannot be undone. The heretic will claim you, just as he has claimed me. Suddenly, the room grew darker. The air thickened. I tried to run, but my legs felt like lead. The walls seemed to pulse, and the very earth beneath me seemed to open up, pulling me toward the center. My breath was shallow, panic clawing at my chest. I couldn't escape. Then, I saw him, the figure from my vision. He was standing in the doorway, a dark, towering silhouette. His eyes gleamed with a red glow that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of the air. He was not human. He was something ancient, something primal. And I knew, in that moment, that everything I had been taught, everything I had believed, was a lie. The heretic was real. And now, I was his. Isabella's voice echoed in my ear, soft and haunting. Welcome, seeker. You wanted the truth. Now, you will serve it. I turned to face the heretic, my legs no longer able to move, my mind spiraling into madness. His presence suffocated me, overwhelmed me. He reached out, his hand cold as ice, and I felt the power surge through me, an ancient, malevolent force claiming my soul. The last thing I heard before the darkness consumed me was Isabella's voice, whispering in the wind. You are no longer a man. You are a servant of the heretic. And this is just the beginning.